So something else I found here. Now this was not new to the book. I just didn't catch it last time. Was it 3 years ago? The first time around, but having read and written so much more since then, now it caught my eye. And that was, you discussed in the 1950s this thing called Trainfire.
Yes.
Which was I'm going to call it, oh, you can tell me if I'm wrong. It was like a philosophy around training for more realistic conditions in combat.
Correct. So,
and you listed a series of principles. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there was two that stood out to me that I want to come back to make sure we discuss.
Sure.
Because they align so much with everything I keep seeing over and over and over again. One of them is the typical envelope of engagements, 300 meters, 300 yards. Like that's, whereas a lot of people have this fantasy, especially with like snipers that, oh, it's always 800,000, 1,200 yards all the time.
Right.
And the statistics just don't show that. Not that it can't happen, but that's just not the statistics.
Right.
And the second one was, more or less that we don't live in a prone world, that the nature of the target conditions, and I think you're probably not shooting from prone, but Trainfire did say that you would likely shoot from something supported, whether it's kneeling or resting on a barrier, or if you're standing in a foxhole, but
or a tree.
That's realistic, or a tree. So I'm going to kick it back over to you now, though. So, what was the whole idea of Trainfire?
Okay, so we fought in World War II. We fought and came to a draw in the Korean War, and then I say this because the target shooters out there, God love them, because if it was up to them, we would have gone back to bullseye shooting. And if you ask the vast majority of them, they don't understand anything about Trainfire. They just know Trainfire bad. Okay. Trainfire was the end of civilization as we know it. And so basically, Eisenhower is the president, and he receives a letter from a civilian. And this is the true origin of Trainfire, because if you try look at reading these forums or message boards or all this other stuff, nobody knows what they're talking about. I heard one. I don't know if you ever heard of the Vietnam era quick kill that was a program that was designed by Lucky McDaniel. People are saying that this 1965 program is what led the Army to create Trainfire in the mid 1950s. But I digress. So this guy writes a letter to President Eisenhower, and he's like, you know what? I spent my life shooting. There's got to be a better way. So Eisenhower flies this guy to Washington and basically sits him down in front of a bunch of Army personnel. And they start a series of research where they're like, well, why do we do it this way? To really appreciate it and know why we used to use bullseye targets, you've got to look at and I'll just really briefly cover it. You got to look at the Army from like the 1920s and the 1930s, because you'll really appreciate this as far as the approach to training for when you're worried about taking care of your neighborhood. If you're interested in self-defense, then this is the approach that we used to use. So back in the day, you're out on a fort on the American prairie somewhere. You would have your marksmanship training. And that's, gentlemen, this is an 03 Springfield. Here's the sights. This is how you work them. This top notch, believe it or not, is for 2,800 yard shooting, which is another story in itself. And the thing is, it's like, okay, here's how you hold it. Here's the positions. Here's your trigger control. Here's how you line up the sights. And then you would practice on bullseye targets. And they wanted to see, here, you got to score this many points off of these scoring rings on the bullseye targets, because we're training and we're testing your marksmanship. Okay. Which boiled down to the essentials is the ability to hit the mark. Okay, you're trying to hit the mark with a rifle bullet. That's all. Then there's a big parade. Everybody gets their bolo badge, and you're qualified as marksman, sharpshooter, and expert. So after the marksmanship training, that's where, you know, you fired your score on the rifle range, and I fired my score on the rifle range. And, you know, you get your expert badge, I get my sharpshooter badge. I was having a bad day. When that's done, then the musketry training begins. And in the United States, it was called musketry training up until after World War II. What musketry training is now squad leader Matt takes all of his squad that have qualified, and he goes off to a series of training events that trains that squad in collective fire. So marksmanship was all about individual fire. This is you all by yourself. And then musketry was engaging silhouette targets collectively as a squad. And so, for example, you would get trained. That's where you got training on range estimation, because shooting on a known distance range, despite what some of the target shooters will tell you, you don't learn how to estimate range on a known distance range. Okay, not as long as you can like look over to the side, see the little sign that says 300 yards, and you busy apply it to your sights. So from there, so you get range estimation, you get sketching, you get fire control orders, and this is stuff the squad leaders getting trained in too. And then you would go through a series of practices and exercises. So for instance, you take your squad over to one of the musketry ranges. And they had musketry ranges just like they had marksmanship ranges. So you would go to a musketry range, and it's like, okay, Sergeant Matt, go ahead and, deploy your people on that, have your people on that berm. Come on back here and talk to me. Come on back here and see me once you're all settled. And then when everybody is there, you're going, okay, so this problem is there's a enemy rifle squad down in the wood line, and I need you to control the fire of your squad so that they can effectively engage that target. And then,
so I'm curious, because you're saying effectively control your fire, because what's the definition of that? Because in my mind, that means
so basically, it's a case of, all right, so like normal rule of thumb, if when it came to the time when you had automatic riflemen, it's like, okay, automatic riflemen, you're going to be, for this nature of target, you're going to be on the flanks. You're going to start on the right flank and move to the center. You're going to move from the left, and you're going to go to the center. And then there's this much overlap. Or if the target is engaged in what we call enfilade, where it's like a column that's pointed in your direction, then you're going to, okay, so you guys are going to engage this.
Okay.
So and then to your specific question, you got to remember, you got to understand, back then, the only guy that had binoculars was the squad leader. So when he's looking at those E-type silhouettes that are in the wood line at the end of the range, he's the only one that can see them. Because you lay down there with your 03 Springfield and you're looking with iron sights, you can't see the target. So what he has to do is go, and this is where it gets involved. We're basically, okay, see that fence line? See that 300-yard fence line that, that's between us and the target? I want everybody to aim at the top strand of barbed wire on that fence, because you can all see that. So I want you to aim there, but I want you to have your sights set for 600 yards. So the squad leader was able to calculate that, okay, if they aim here, if they aim at a target 300 yards away and they have their elevation set for 600 yards, they're going to engage these targets at the edge of the wood line, which I estimate to be X yards away. He's acting as a forward observer and telling these guys how to aim and how to aim their rifles so that they can hit a target that they can't see.
Okay.
Which, as you know, a lot of people will tell you that, you know, yeah, you know, shooting at E-type silhouettes on the KD range is a lot of fun. But the thing is, in real life, soldiers are doing soldierly things and they're not cooperating with your efforts to shoot them.
Yeah.
So this was the state of marksmanship and musketry training for decades. Then World War II starts. And you had a situation where officer cadets for technical fields were being pulled out of their school and told, congratulations, you're being commissioned in the infantry. And once we had air superiority, anti-aircraft gunners all of a sudden found themselves as infantrymen. Well, even infantrymen, after the initial phases of the war, where they had to, they had to get warm bodies down range quickly. All of a sudden, it was like, okay, you hit the bullseye this many times, you got your BOLO badge, you're qualified, okay, and we'll kick the can down the road as far as musketry training goes. And so people would deploy, and then what eventually happened is that people just qualified on. They just worried about the qualification. They worried about the qualification. They were qualifying on bullseyes, and then there were a couple of efforts where they added new firing tables to where, okay, after you do the bullseye, then we're going to have what we call transition fire, where you're going to start shooting at E-type silhouettes and everything, E and F-type silhouettes, and, you know, for a kneeling man and a prone man. And but then it was, you know, everything fell by the wayside, because it's like, okay, as long as you're authorizing people, you know, the vast majority of commanders, especially with the, you know, the modern, you know, the mechanized warfare and everything else, once they get to pin that BOLO badge on your chest, it's like, you know what, you're qualified on rifle. Okay, my work here is done. So now fast forward, we're back in the 50s. The senior, you know, the field grade officers and the generals and the senior NCOs that had all been trained under bullseyes and fought in World War II and Korea were the ones that were pushing for Trainfire. Because what they did is they conducted a bunch of research, and I have a bunch of the reports in my files. I mean, they were like, hey, you know, does it do us any good to personalize the stock length? And they would have a test where, all right, we're going to have 50 guys with this length, you know, fitted stocks, and then, you know, 50 guys with all standard stocks, and we'll compare the scores and everything else. Needless to say, we never had any adjustable stocks on the on the M14. Okay, so then they found out that you know, they came up with the list, and that was one of the things that I really liked about Trainfire, that list that you admired so much, because the thing is, it's like, you know, even though, you know, and maybe I reproduced too much, you know. I had second thoughts about reproducing the whole thing, because I was worried somebody was going to go, well, you know, he's talking about police sniping. It's like, no, this is an example of, you know what? This is a list where the designers of the program all agreed upon this is the target. And one of the most successful things that you can do when you're setting up a training program for a weapons-based training program, you define the target, and then you work backwards from that. Instead of just going, hey, we're gonna, we're gonna do this, and we're gonna see how tight we can get the group, and all this other stuff. It's what I call the Cracker Barrel School of Training Development. That's where a bunch of guys sit around the Cracker Barrel, going, "Hey, Matt, what do you think? What do you think the standard should be? Well, I don't know, John. What do you think? Hey, you know what? Let's do this. Yeah, okay." Yeah. So how do you measure success? Okay, because anything else is arbitrary. So you get, they said, hey, look, you know what? This emphasis on 500 to 600 yard targets, research, basically we kept a bunch of statistics in World War II and Korea, and it turns out that the majority of targets were all within 300 yards. And you know what? There's a lot of people that said, hey, I couldn't see a German soldier, or I couldn't see a Japanese soldier. I was just, I saw muzzle flashes on some Pacific island somewhere, and I was shooting at them. And that's where they came up with that list. It was like, hey, you know what? We've been beating our brains out teaching everybody how to use a loop sling, and we can't find any evidence that anybody actually used a loop sling in World War II.
So you reminded me. I revised it from time to time, but there's an article I wrote about Norman Hitchman's report, 1952, and he was citing a bunch of stuff, and this ultimately was part of the development that led, in my opinion, to the AR-15 and 223. But he cites this study here, which is Pike and Gopal, which is what we're talking about here is building people's experience, where they analyze a whole bunch of battlefields and then said, all right, what was the actual visibility of it? And you can see like probability of actually seeing what you're shooting at drops as soon as you cross that around 300. Like this is, what you get. So it's just kind of funny. All these things aligning together.
Right. Because the thing, see, what people fail to understand is that, training on the range is a means to an end. But for a lot of people, it becomes an end in itself. And the way I approached it was, see, back in 1977, when I went to basic combat training, when I enlisted, I did it at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Fort Jackson, South Carolina is where people go for advanced individual training in becoming a clerk typist. Okay, they used to call them Remington Raiders. And the thing is, I had a bunch of, teammates in my training platoon that, I was going to go to Fort Benning for infantry school, but these guys were going to stay at Fort Jackson and become clerk typists. And the thing is, during the tactical training, they were all out there learning how to camouflage, doing 3-second rushes, learning about cover and concealment, doing low crawls, tactical movement, and everything else. And that's just the clerk typist in basic. Mm-hmm. And that completely, everybody seems to ignore that when they're designing their courses of fire, because you have well-defined targets. You have all the time in the world to shoot them. And that's where I came up with the whole thing about, most people train to engage targets that are cooperating with their efforts to kill them.
Mm-hmm.